tweaks and niceties. So basically making multi-column layouts, playing around with floats, just some basic layout stuff that, is a little bit of an extension of what we did last week. If you are not, if you were not here last week, it's totally cool. You can find the slides at, not the slides. You can find files at, let me just make this larger real quick. jendelafuente.com/project.zip. If you go to that URL, it will immediately download a zip file. That's all the files that we were working on last week, so you have something to start with. Otherwise, if you have files from last week, we can use those as well. If you are ready to go, I definitely want you to open your projects in your text editor of choice. So I'm just going to drag mine into Espresso. Your project may vary. Mine happens to look like, well, it's here somewhere. Hold on. I'll just do this. Mine happens to look like this. So last week we talked a little bit about basic styles, changing fonts using Google Fonts, changing colors of things, changing backgrounds, starting to use the float property, which is how I get this photo to sit next to my text. We're going to expand upon that. That's really the main thing we're going to expand upon today, is the concept of floats and the concept of making multi-column layouts. So stuff like this. You've got a box here, and in general web layout, you've probably got some kind of header, maybe with a logo or something like that. You might have some navigation down here. You probably have a footer down here, maybe with some copyright information, extra stuff. Maybe that's where you put some of your social media links, whatever you choose. But right in between here, between the navigation and the bottom of your page, you may decide you want a multiple column layout. So typical blog layout, this is my content. And this is a sidebar of some variety. It could be flipped. You could have your sidebar on the other side. Some of you may decide you want, of course I don't have an eraser, but that's fine. Some of you may decide you want a 3-column layout where you have 2 sidebars and content in the middle. It's really up to you. But this is a pretty typical page layout if you look out there. I mean, even if you look at WordPress blogs, it's pretty typical to have content and some kind of sidebar. And this is what we're going to build. We're going to learn how to build this and the general concept of multi-column layout today. So keep this little drawing in mind. I always find it helpful before I start building a page to kind of sketch these out, because it also helps me with naming my classes and my IDs. So I might call this content. And it kind of helps, and then I'll probably call this like main or something like that. Sketching these out really helps me visualize what I'm going to build, so that if something goes wrong when I'm trying to style it, I can be like, oh, something went wrong somewhere, and I have to start doing some math. So does anybody have any questions off the bat before I dive into this? All right, let's build some pages. So some of you may have, an about page of some variety, and maybe you want to add other pages to your site. You want to put your resume there, or you want to maybe put some links to stories you've written, like a very rudimentary portfolio page. We'll do that first, and then I'll jump into layouts. Really, really simple if you want to add a page to your website. In your project folder, so I have an index.html. As I said, every file must have an index.html. But from there, you can create another HTML document for something else. Say you have a resume or portfolio or something like that. What I would recommend, if you're going to use kind of the same general template, is, and by template I mean you're going to use the same style sheets across these pages. you're going to probably use, maybe you pulled in some Google fonts and you want to use those same fonts throughout your whole site to have a cohesive look. This is what I always suggest to people, especially when you're doing it with old school HTML, is save as, open up your index.html file and just save as. And so I'm within my project folder, and I'm just going to call it, about.html. You can call it, you can call your file whatever you want. Just, again, keep in mind the best practices for file naming conventions. Keep it one word, short, and lowercase, because these are, again, case sensitive. So this way, if I went to, say my website was on my domain, which is jendelafuente.com, say that this index.html file was in that domain. So if I went to jendelafuente.com, you would see the contents of the index file, correct? And then maybe I wanted to link to that about.html file. Really simple. Just make sure. So say right about here, I decided I was going to make some navigation. Just really, really quick. I mean, I'm not even going to style it. If I wanted to link to the other pages that I created, it's just like linking to anything else. href, again, we're going to go somewhere whenever we see the a tag and the href, and then the name of the file. I don't have to put a domain or anything like that. In this case, I want to link to that about.html file. And then I can put whatever text I want about me. Again, this is completely unstyled. So there's my navigation up here. And just to make sure that I'm going to, just to show that I'm going to be at an about page, I'm just going to change a couple things in my about.html. So I'm just going to change the headline so you can see the difference between the two pages. So if I click this About Me link, it's going to look for that about.html file in the same directory. And there we go. That's how you link all these different pages that you create together. The reason I say that you should start with one and sort of copy it and change out the content is that you don't want to keep having to copy, replicate this part over and over and over again. You know, you want to make sure that your styles are always the same. You're always going to use the same style sheet. No matter how many pages your site is, it's going to control all the styles of all your pages on your website. But you want to make sure that you have the correct template. It's just easier to copy one instead of like type all this stuff out over and over and over again. So all I'm going to do for my new About page is I'm just going to delete the content pretty much. So I can put new content in here. But I'm keeping the same general structure. I'm keeping that div ID container, keeping the body tags, HTML tags, keeping everything in the head. That is my style sheets. And now I'm just going to create a brand new page with whatever content I wish to put in there. Does that make sense?
Jen, will you go back real quick to your code on your index?
Sure. So the only thing that's different between my index.html page and my about page is essentially this part right here. Everything that's in between the container tags is different. But I'm linking to the same style sheet, linking to the same Google fonts, and all of that stuff. Does that make sense?
Yes. Is that ID, do you have to specify that ID in CSS, or is that just like, that's basic HTML fine?
Yeah, it's basic HTML, you're fine. You're going to use the same structure. Remember that with IDs, there's only one per page. It's not one per website. I'm always going to have this container on every single page because I want this white space to contain all my content.
What about the navigation though?
And I can eventually copy I'm going to eventually copy the navigation to all the other pages too, so that I can navigate back and forth. I just put it on one and didn't put it on the other. So that's actually a really good point. I'm going to copy this navigation and I'm going to put it on my About page too. just so I have navigation on all my pages. So if I want people to be able to go back to the home page, I would say href index.html because that's the page I want them to go back to. That is my home page. And I can say home, close the link, maybe put a pipe in there. Everybody know where the pipe is on your keyboard? It's right above the enter key. And if I preview this about page, so I've got no content, I just have a headline there. Here's my navigation that I'm starting to build. I can go back home to the index page, or I can navigate back to the about page, and so on and so forth as I build my navigation and create all these different pages. I'm going to leave the index alone. I'm going to work mainly with this second page. This is where I'm going to start building all these multiple columns and all that fun stuff. But first, a little bit of a refresher. We talked about classes and IDs and basic CSS last week. You're going to use CSS to create these columns. So just keep that in mind. Remember that with classes and IDs, classes are the recyclables of CSS. You can use them on multiple elements. So if I want to make something red, I can create a class called red, and I can apply it to text. I can apply it to lists. I can apply it to anything. IDs, I tend to use those more for structure. So things like I want to make a header, or I want to make column, left side column and right side column. I'd probably use IDs for those, just because I know I'm going to have one sidebar or one main content area or one container. And I can reuse these throughout all the different pages so that I can start building templates, and all I do is I change out all the content. But before we jump into that stuff, I do want to talk about block and inline elements. This is really important in order to understand how to make multiple columns. There are two kinds of elements in HTML, block and inline. Most tags are block elements by default. Your p tags, the div tag, ULs, header, footer, article, all the h tags are all block elements. And as it says, think of them as giant boxes. They're good containers. They tend to occupy the entire width of any page by default. The way I like to think of them is they're divas. They occupy the whole stage. They stand there alone. They're Beyonce. They're not her dancers, they're Beyonce. She's all alone on stage. They push everything else out of the way. That's the main thing you need to remember about block elements. So by default, a div will always occupy the entire width of your container. And you'll see a lot of this in action. So a paragraph is a block element. Notice it just takes up the entire width, and then the next thing comes after it. A list, a UL tag is a block element. Even though there's all this space next to this UL, that paragraph starts on its own line. So that's what I mean by block elements. The key to making columns is basically making block elements not behave like block elements. So that's why this is a very important concept. Inline elements, they play nice with other content. They are your backup dancers. They are nice to other people. They sit within block elements. As the name implies, they sit in line with whatever surrounds them. Few examples of these are the A tag. The strong tag is one of them. The M tag, the thing that makes things italic. Image tags and spans. Those are examples of inline elements. And you can see exactly how inline elements work because, for instance, whoops. If I make a link within this paragraph, so let's just say I made a link here. sorry. If I make a link within a paragraph, notice it sits within that paragraph, right? It doesn't jump it to a separate line. That's what I mean by inline element. Keeps everything in line. Same thing with this bold. When I make something bold, it doesn't jump it to another line. Inline elements are really, really useful for things like, say in this headline, I want to make only the word kind a different color, something that's not black. But I don't want to jump this to its own line, right? That'd be kind of weird. So let me remove this break. And in my CSS, pretty sure I already created a class. Yeah. So I have a class called yellow in my CSS that I'm going to use. And say I just want to make the word kind yellow. Nothing else, just that word kind. Look at the difference between when I use a block element to accomplish this versus an inline. So first, I'm going to try with a div. A div is a block element. Div is a diva. It's the way I remember it. Shares the stage all with nobody. So I'm going to surround this word kind with a div, and I'm going to assign it the class of yellow to make that word yellow. But look what happens to my headline. This word is all by itself, and that's really not what I want to accomplish. But because the div is a block element, it pushed it and said, oh, diva coming through, I'm going to get my own line. Sorry, can't share with nobody. So that's what happens when you use block elements. They jump to their own line. They occupy that space all by themselves. But look at the difference if I use a span. The span tag is an inline element. If I use this and I hit refresh, it keeps that word in line. It doesn't jump it to its own element. Does that make sense? So that way I can spotlight certain things in something that is normally a block element. So this whole H1 is a block element, but I can put inline elements in there and it won't disrupt the flow of what's going on. So that's block versus inline. So again, div versus spans. Divs are block elements. Think of them as divas. They like to be on their own line and push everything out of the way. They occupy the stage alone. Spans, they're in line. They're helpful for when you just want to make something look different within a div or any block element, but you don't want that styled thing to sit in its own line. And like I said, the art of columns are making block elements behave like inline elements. And you do that via CSS. I like to use divs to create my columns. So we're keeping this little guy in mind, this little drawing that I have on the board. The way you make columns is using floats. And I apologize, these slides are not on these the main slide body. I have to add them to it. So apologies if you can't follow along on your own computer. But floats, talked about floats a little bit last week. If I go back to the baby here, this baby is applying, there's a float class applied to this baby. And normally, if I didn't put this float, and remove this class real quick. Normally, if my item didn't have a float applied to it, notice these paragraphs at the bottom. You know, paragraphs are block elements, so they're like, no, I'm not going to pay attention to your rules. I am supposed to be on my own line. That is the law of the land. I will be on my own line. But when you add a float to something, in this case, I have a class called left. And in my CSS, if I look at it, here's my class called left. And I have said anything that has a class of left, you're going to apply a float. And what float means is the object that you apply this class to is going to float to the left of the page. But it's going to allow anything that happens to be below it to sit next to it. The item will be on the left of the page, but the text is going to float around it. Whoops, it's the wrong page. The text that is going to be, that would normally be below it, it's saying, no, it's cool, you don't have to sit below me. I'm going to allow you, normally as block elements, I'm going to allow you to sit next to my little baby here. That is what floats do. Learning how to use floats is how to make elements sit next to each other. They're floating in water. It's like a sponge. If you float a sponge in water, like all the water just kind of flows around it. That's essentially what's happening here. When you apply a float to something, you're essentially giving it inline behavior. You're making them be nice to each other.
Could you go to the class part again that you put for the...
Oh, sure. So in my CSS, I had a class called left. And I gave it these properties, float left, and I want a margin of 20 pixels all around.
And then in the HTML?
And in the HTML, all I did was I applied this class of left to the image itself.
Oh, okay.
Because I want the image to sit on the left side of the page.
Do you have to do that for each image?
Whatever, only the images that I want that particular thing to happen to. You'll see the difference if I did right. I'm just going to add a margin. If I change this class to right, the image sits now to the right, and all the text is flowing around it, the space to the left. So that's the difference between the two. The one that you're going to use the most often is left. Almost everything is going to be floating to the left.
Jen, why is that?
Because generally you want to start from the left side of the page, and you just want everything to sit, to keep like.
So it's the command that you usually use because that's where you're going to start, like, as you're...
Right, right. You want to start from the left and read, because we are a left to right reading culture. So if you're in a right to left reading culture, you're probably going to use flow right more often, actually. So the float, like I said, it's kind of a positioning property used to lay out a page. You can have a sidebar, it probably has a float left, and the main content float right. You can also just apply float left to this main content. There's many different ways to do this, and I will demonstrate shortly. Like I said, if you float something, you immediately turn it into an inline element. The other thing that's really important about this is you need to assign a width to whatever it is you're going to float. Otherwise, it's going to assume still, I got to occupy the whole width of the page. No, you have to assign a width too. And we'll see the perils that can happen when you do this. So in my example, I'm going to use this about page. There's nothing in it right now. I'm going to make a 2-column layout in this about page. So I've got some navigation, and I'm still within the container that I've been using. I'm just going to introduce a couple of IDs. Going to keep them blank for now. I'm going to actually put my sidebar, I'm going to follow what I have on the board here. I'm going to put my sidebar on the right and my main content on the left. So my first ID, I'm just going to call a main. And my second ID, I'm going to call sidebar. So 2 divs equal in dignity, and I haven't put anything in them yet. if you wish, just put some content in both of these. Whatever you like. You can put pictures, you can put a headline. I'm just going to put a subhead real quick. I'm just going to grab some paragraphs.
Hey, Jen.
Yes.
So, technically speaking, when we're filling stuff on the ground,
Uh-huh.
and we're organizing, we're writing the basic HTML and we're organizing our content. The reason why we would assign different divs is to be able to basically arrange our content and then go style it.
Right, exactly. So what Sarah was saying is exactly right. I'm using these divs to sort of section off my content. Again, it's the concept of bento box. Like, this is what's going to be in this particular box, and then this is what's going to be in this particular box. And then I'm going to style them so that they appear in a specific way.
And this is why wireframing is so important in the beginning, is that you really need to know what the intent is for the content before you even put it into your HTML, because you need to have a vision for what you're then going to do in CSS.
Bingo.
Otherwise, you're going to have to keep rewriting your HTML.
Bingo. That's why this right here is very important. Otherwise, this will save you a lot of pain and a lot of rewriting. So my intention is to have a main column and a sidebar column. Your intentions may be different, but for now, this is what I'm going to work with. Bingo, bingo, bingo. So right now, if I went back to my About page, it's not really looking anything like my wireframe. This is all in the main div, and it's still super wide. This is all in the subhead, and it's still super wide. Again, CSS is where I'm going to make these things pay attention to each other. The way I like to teach, so if you go into the style.css, whoops, and I will make these files available afterward. I'm just going to create a section called 2-column layout so I know what I'm working with. So remember, in CSS, if I'm working with an ID, my selector is going to have a # and then the name of the ID, right? So div ID main in HTML becomes # main in my CSS file. I have another ID that I'm working with called sidebar. So I'm going to put that in my CSS as well. The way I like to teach column layout to folks is I like to put really garish colors in the background, just as a teaching method. This will help you spot errors. So I'm going to put fuchsia in 1, just so you can see what's going on. And I'm going to say green for the other. You can remove these background colors later on, obviously, but for teaching purposes, we're gonna make everybody go blind. I apologize in advance. So if I refresh, there are my 2 divs. The really horribly pink one is content, is main, and the horribly green one is sidebar. So they're still not sitting next to each other. So you may think to yourself, well, okay, I want to make them sit next to each other. I'm going to assign a float to each of them. I'm just going to use left instead of left and right. I find it a little easier to learn floats this way. So assign them both a float left. You're still thinking to yourself, well, okay, cool, I assigned them floats, but they're still not sitting next to each other. My sidebar, my smaller subhead, suddenly got smaller, cool, but they're still not sitting next to each other. And that's because I haven't assigned widths. to either of these properties. So they know they're supposed to sit next to each other. But this main guy, super huge, still occupying the entire width of my page. And I gotta cut that down. And this is where math starts to come into play. And however you feel about math, it's essential here. Keep in mind that both of these are sitting inside a container, a div container. Right up here. That's my main container. That's the portion with the white background. I want to keep all my content inside this container. And this container happens to have a width defined in my CSS of 960 pixels. So that's the width I have to work with. Any columns I create, their widths must equal 960 pixels, or they will not sit next to each other. It will be too wide. The reason why most people use 960 is this is a nicely dividable number. You can divide it by 3, you can divide it by 4, you can divide it by 5. It's actually it's a very useful number. So say I want to have a layout that's kind of like my main box is 2/3 and my sidebar is like 1/3 of the page. Maybe that's the kind of proportions I'm looking for. So what I can do, since I know I'm working with 960, is I can say 2/3 of 960. So 3 divided by, or 960 divided by 3 is 320. So I know that's 1/3 of 960. So sidebar, I know that I want this to be 1/3, 320 pixels. Seems simple enough. And then the rest, minus 320 minus 960 is 640. Twisted my arm. So I'm going to assign that width to my main. So these two columns, if I added them up together, equal 960 pixels. I'm within my container size. Does that make sense? And if I refresh, here we go. They're sitting next to each other. However, there are a couple of problems. There's some flaws with this. And this is why I put colors in the background. Notice I'm suffering from a little bit of claustrophobia here. My text is butting right up against my background color, the edge of my box. These two boxes are kissing each other. We have kissing cousin syndrome, and that's not cool. Like, I need a little more air in my layout. And you're like, all right, cool. Could add some air. That'd be really nice. We use padding to add air inside a box, right? Inside an element. So say maybe I add 20 pixels of padding to my main, just to give it a little bit more air. And maybe even my sidebar, I add 20 pixels more. Oops. I just want a little bit of air. Okay, cool. However, when I refresh this, sadness has resulted. Such sadness. Now they're not sitting next to each other anymore. What happened? Yes. I am now over my 960 limit. And this is where this lovely thing called the box model comes into play. Whenever you start adding padding or margin to an element, you need to be aware of how much space it's actually taking up. So back in my CSS, I said width of 640 pixels, but that's not actually how wide this main div is. How wide is my div actually? How much space is it actually taking up? Can somebody tell me? 680. Because not only is it 640 pixels wide, I've added padding, and padding is on the left and the right. So it's an additional 40 pixels. My main div is actually occupying 680 pixels. Same thing with sidebar. How big is my sidebar actually? 360. And if I do the math, and God, I hope this math is correct. I'm really terrible at math, guys. I'm sorry. 1,040 pixels. That is way too wide. I have exceeded the limit. And that's why they're not sitting next to each other. So beware of the math. How am I going to fix this problem? What do you think I have to do? Yes, it's exactly it. I have to make the width smaller to account for the padding that is being applied to the left and the right. So I know that my padding is 20, which means that's 40 extra pixels of padding total. I'm going to trim some fat, and I'm going to make my width 600.
What is padding again?
So padding is basically adding extra, think of it like styrofoam peanuts, like inside a box. So you're basically saying, like, I don't want to touch the edges of my box, and so I'm going to add a little air inside that box. Yeah. And if you have background colors, guys, it is important that you use padding because the padding will include the background. Like, you won't have this weird, like, white box suddenly, which sometimes happens to folks. And same thing with sidebar. I'm gonna shave off another 40 pixels. And if I go back to my example, the world is right again. So this time, I've kind of solved my claustrophobia problem. This text is not butting right up against my box, and it's not happening here either. There's a little bit more air in my layout. But what if I wanted to solve kissing cousin syndrome? I need to add space between these two elements. To add space between two elements, you use margin. That's the difference between padding and margin. If you look at the box model, notice that your background color extends into the padding, but it doesn't extend into the margin. It's just like a gutter if you're working with print. Margin is what separates two elements. If you have two elements that are butting up against each other and you need to separate them, use margin. If you need to add padding inside a box so that your text doesn't butt up against the edges, use padding. Padding is inside out. Does that make sense? I hope it just made sense. So to separate these two, I'm going to add some margin to my sidebar. And I only need to add it on one side. I'm going to add it on the left side of my sidebar, because I'm cool with, like, where it's sitting otherwise. I'm going to add some margin left. So let's say I decide to add 30 pixels of margin. And if I go back, I have this problem again. You solve it the same way that you solved it the first time. Just make the width, the actual width of the box, smaller. So I know that since I added margin only on one side, I only have to remove 30 pixels, not 60. So out of my width, I take out a chunk, that 30 pixel chunk, and then I get that. So now I have two colored boxes that have a little bit of breathing room in them, and they're also not touching each other. Of course, if I remove the backgrounds, you're really not going to see. The difference is a little less stark. But I like to keep the backgrounds in there just so if you notice that your columns are not sitting next to each other as you intended, it's probably because your widths are all sort of out of whack. It's a really good debugging method, actually. So that's why I keep the backgrounds there. And you may want, like, you know, if you have different boxes in your sidebar, you might want that to be a different color. Like maybe not green, but CF, CF, CF. That's a light gray. EEE is an even lighter gray. You just want a subtle touch in the background. I'm going to use EEE. So there. My subhead kind of stands out a little. My sidebar stands out a little bit from the rest of my stuff. So this is a concept of like the math involved in making columns kind of makes sense to you guys. And that's really how you can go on and make 2, 3, 4, 5, however many column layouts you want. It's just you got to know the math behind it. You got to know what the main container, what the width of the main container is that you're working with, and just make sure all your columns fit in between them. You know, adjust the padding and the margin is necessary so you don't have things that are like sticking up right next to each other, but then just adjust the widths as you need to. And this works for other things. Oh my goodness, everybody's calling me. They're all getting ignored. I'm going to show you another way this becomes helpful. But before I do that, actually, I need to call your attention to a very important class and a very important concept called clearing. So in my CSS, just about every single CSS sheet I write, I always have a class called clear. And when you start working with floats, this concept of clearing is very important because otherwise you have stuff that happens like this. Well, that's not what I intended to happen. I want that trapped space to actually come after. Remember the thing about floats. You saw this with little baby. If you float an item, everything that comes after it is just going to keep sitting in that empty space, right? It's going to keep until there's enough content to get past the baby. It's not going to start occupying full lines again. That is where clearing is really, really, really important. Otherwise, like I said, you wind up with this. Oh, I'm trapped. I'm gonna add a clear here, and then I'm gonna explain what it does. If I refresh, not trapped in the matrix anymore. So that's the difference between, oh goody, I'm not trapped, and help, I'm trapped. I want to be, the thing to remember about clears is this. After I have floated some items, so these two items were floated left. If I want to make sure the thing that comes after them is on its own line, I need to apply what's called a clear. You have to clear the float or else things can look horribly awry, as I just demonstrated. Clear is a CSS property often seen like this. Clear, both. This essentially tells an element that follows some floated object. Hey, start a new line here after these floated objects. We have a diva coming who demands her own stage. Because what's going to happen when you put a clear is this. It's going to essentially say, hey, you know this space that's just kind of hanging out here? I want you to clear that space out. I don't want anything that comes after this to fall into that black hole, that little black hole space there. I don't want it to become trapped. I need you to clear out and make a new line. They're like the clear property is kind of like the bouncers of the world. But clearing out some space so that I can now occupy a separate line. This is a very common problem that people have once they start screwing around with floats and multiple column layouts. Always remember the clear. If you wind up with trapped, it's probably because you didn't clear somewhere. It's a pretty good indication that something went horribly wrong. Yes?
Will you go back to your code? Not the CSS one, but the HTML.
Yeah.
And
So-
what does it mean to do both? When you're specifying both in your CSS for clear?
It means you're clearing out space on both the left and the right. So you're clearing a straight line, essentially.
Okay.
You almost always will say clear both. Very rare instances in which you'll only clear left or right. Yes.
Could you go up to the code for the about page?
Yes. This is the about page.
Well, from your index then,
Okay.
how to link to it, because that's where I was lost.
Oh, all I did was in my index page, I put a link to the about. Like I just threw a link in a navigation.
Okay, because when I do it, it like replaces it makes my headline a link. So.
I just made a separate phrase just to make my life easier. Don't forget to close your link. That might also be part of the problem.
I just didn't do the divs.
Oh. Yeah, you don't have to have this navigation div.
Oh, you don't?
You don't. You can make this a paragraph. You just make this a paragraph too. I just put the navigation div in there just because that's usually how I structure a page. So, and I might want to make all my navigation links a different color than all my other links. That's another reason I would do that too. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Yes?
I have a question. What if there's two sidebars, like one on the left and one on
Right, so you want a 3-column layout,
the right?
essentially.
So, I mean, the clear, is it still clear both or?
You need to do it after the 3rd column.
I say clear both.
Yes, after the 3rd column. So if I wanted to do a 3-column layout, I'll do this really quickly actually. Because this is a really good question. And this is where things get kind of crazy. Let's say I said left sidebar and right, and I'll just leave the other one as sidebar. Or so let's say, and I'm just going to copy this style. I'm going to have to really make this super tiny. Okay, hold on. Hold on, I think my math is all. Okay, I'm just gonna adjust some styles. There we go. That's what I was trying to do. So I could say, I need to actually make my middle column. I'm not doing the math, so I need to make my middle column a little bit bigger. There we go. So that's what I have. I have a 3-column layout. I have to put the clear after this column, so that anything that comes after it doesn't get trapped in that space. But notice that the first column and the second column, like it doesn't, these two know to sit next to each other. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay.
Quick question, Jen.
Yes.
After I put in a href about me, I clicked on it and then it says it's not found.
Here's the thing. Is anybody getting a not found when they click on their about link? The important thing is that you need to make sure that HTML file that you're linking to is inside your project folder, and that is the name of that file. So mine happens to be about.html. If you called it something else, portfolio or whatever, you need to create a file in your project folder. You need to create that second file in your project folder.
You don't create it in brackets?
I mean, you can create it in brackets, but you have to save it to your project folder.
Okay.
Yeah. But look what happens. I changed the name of my file to portfolio.html instead of about.html. First of all, well, that happened. But if I try to click now on my About Me link, notice I didn't change it in index. It's still linking to about.html. If I try to go to it here, it's going to tell me that page is not found. It's because I changed the name of my HTML file and I didn't reflect that in my link. So if I change the file back, I don't get that broken link anymore.
And then you just copied all your index stuff into the about.
Correct.
And then deleted everything except the header.
Correct. This is exactly what I did. When you do this sort of like manual multiple page linking, this is where it gets kind of hairy. I'll tell you right now. Because you have to be cognizant of what your file is called. So here, about.html. And you have to be cognizant about what you call it when you build your navigation. Remember that you have to link to an HTML file that exists. Otherwise, it's going to give you an error. And I can do, let's say I created another HTML file called contact. And I copied the contents of my about.html into here. And I just save it. So remember, all my HTML files are all in that same folder. They all have to stay together. And then maybe I change my headline to I'm a contact page. And maybe this one doesn't have all this crazy sidebar business. But I kept the navigation. And this is where I tell people to get a hold of me. Maybe I put my email address and my social media links here or something like that. Then I have to go back to my other two pages I've already created, and I got to add that page to my navigation, right? Got to do this manually, unfortunately. So to do that, I can say contact me in my navigation. And then I got a link to that file. So what am I linking to? What's going to go in my href? What goes here? Anyone?
.html.
Yes. So contact.html. Close the link. I'm going to add it to my about me as well. And if I refresh my About Me page, I now suddenly have Contact Me. And since I put that contact.html file in my project folder and I linked to it properly, I can go navigate all around. I can go back to About Me. I can even go back to index. I can go back home. So that's how I'm starting to build this navigation. One thing you might want to do, slightly fancy, but recommended. Sometimes from a user standpoint, you want people to know what page they're on. And often you can tell them what page you're on via the headline. But in navigation, it's what we call a marker. You want to give people an idea of like, oh, it's a different color, and I can't click this as a link to go anywhere. I must be on the home page. It's a good user experience. Pretty common to what a lot of people do. I'm going to fix it on the About Me page. real quick. I'm going to remove the link. And so here I know I'm on the home page. If I go to About Me, it's a different color in the navigation. So I can give people that flag that, hey, I'm on the About Me page. Same thing when I go to Contact Me. I can give people that flag, oh, I'm on the Contact Me page. The way I did it is, this is the most basic way to do it. On the respective page, so this is my home page, this is my index.html page. In my navigation, I just removed the link. I didn't surround it with the link. And it just so happened that any plain text is a different color than my links. It's the way my CSS dictated it. So all my links are purple, but all my regular text is this color. I think that's kind of a goldenrod. Same thing in the About Me. I took the link off the About Me, so it showed up as a different color. And same with the Contact page. It's a really easy way to flag your pages, so people know where they are. It's really helpful. One other thing you might want to do is you might want to style your links in your navigation differently, right? Maybe you don't want them to be the same link color as all your regular links in your body. You can do that as well. That's why I have this div right here. This is why I put my navigation inside a div. Because I know at some point I want to make these slightly different. This is another slightly advanced thing with CSS. It's called a nested selector. You can select anything in CSS. And I would say most of the problems people have with styles are because they didn't select things correctly. So I'm going to talk about the different punctuations involved here. So say I want to change all the links in my navigation. I want them to be a different color. And I want them to be bold. Maybe I want them to be bigger too, so that people can see my navigation. So to do that, I put everything in a div. So I know that I'm only going to affect everything that's inside that navigation div. I'm not going to affect anything else. If I look in my CSS, I know that I already have some styles. All my links on my page are purple, and they don't have an underline. It's all links. So of course, that affects the links that are in here too. These links are going to be purple, but I don't want them to be purple. I want them to be different. So I'm going to create a section in my CSS called Navigation Styles. I like to section off my CSS just so I know where everything is. And I know that I'm working with a div called Navigation, a div that has an ID of navigation. And I know that I only want to affect links inside that div called Navigation. So my selector becomes this. You notice the space? The space is really important here. We talked last week about how you can select multiple tags and style them at the same time just by using a comma to list all the tags that you want to select. If you see this in CSS, you see one selector, so I have an ID here, and then a second selector, the A tag, and they happen to be separated just by a space. That means it's a nested selector. And what this means is I am only trying to style all the A links, all the A tags inside a div that happens to be called Navigation. So the first tag you see is sort of like the encapsulating thing. It's the first thing that that CSS is going to look for. Oh, where's the div called navigation. If you put something after that, it's saying, oh, I want all these elements inside that div to be styled a specific way. So for instance, this is how I can change all the colors in my navigation all by itself. Say I wanted those particular navigation links are going to be red, and I'm going to make them bigger. And I'm going to make them bold. Font weight, bold. If I refresh, there you go. I've made my only the links within my navigation bold, a bigger font size, and they're red. Here's a regular link in my navigation, in my page. And it's still that purple color, and it's not bold, and it's still the same size as the rest of my text. So this is an even more specific way to target something. But you'll notice you have this kind of going on, and you're like, wait a second. That's pretty easy to fix too. That's just text, right? So this style is only specifically targeting A links. And, well, that's not in an A link, and neither are my pipes. So again, really simple to fix. Just add a style to navigation to affect all the text. And I don't want to change it to red. I want to keep it the color. But I'll at least give it the same font size so it doesn't look all sad and not correctly sized. I'll at least do that. And actually, what I could even do further is this. I can delete that. Because this style is going to affect everything that's inside the navigation, regardless of whether it's a link or not. It's just going to apply that style to all the text inside navigation. All I want to change here is the color of that particular link. If I do this, now my navigation has, it matches the size, and it matches the weight. It's just a different color. I still have that flag of I'm on the home page. I can still navigate to About Me, and I can still navigate to Contact Me. And if you notice, when I changed that style, it changed it across all three of these pages. That's the beauty of learning CSS. It didn't have to change each of these individual pages manually. As long as that style sheet is linked in all these pages, all those styles will apply across your entire site. Any questions so far? All kind of makes sense. I could do another thing just to be fancy. You can do text align center. Just to center my navigation if I wanted to. I could also could add a border at the bottom. So whenever you use the border property, it has three attributes. The size of the border style, the default is solid. I'll show you a couple others in a second. And the color of the border. So 333 is a charcoal. It's a dark gray. And I can further separate that navigation from the rest of my text. Could even do something like this. Border top and border bottom. And I'll get that effect. So I'm affecting just that navigation container. And I'm starting to add these styles to it so that it looks, I kind of set apart my navigation from the rest of my site. That's feeling a little claustrophobic for you? How do I get rid of claustrophobia? What CSS property do I use? I want to add padding. I can say, well, maybe not that much. That's way too much padding. Remember, if you see two numbers in padding, the first one applies top and bottom only, and the second one applies to left and right. So in this particular case, I want to have padding only on the top and bottom of 10 pixels and no padding on the left and right. Whoops. If I do that, I can breathe. Let your elements breathe, guys. It's really nice. And so now I have a little bit of room between my border and the actual links inside my navigation. Really simple, super, super, super simple navigation. With borders, I just want to point out, so solid is the default, as I said. There is dotted, which, as the name implies. So pay attention to the top border. Gives you dots. It's really kind of hard to see on this giant screen. There is dashed. Oops. Which will give you, as I like to call it, the coupon line. So if you want to make like coupon lines everywhere, a box with a dashed border, it's a quick way to make coupons. There's double. Double is actually one of my favorites. If you use double, it gives you a double line. It's really hard to see in small sizes, so I'm going to bump this up to like 10 just so you can see what I'm talking about. So you see how it gave me a double border instead? So you kind of need like a larger pixel size to really make the effect happen. If I do it 5, you can still kind of see the double line. Double is one of my favorites. I use it all the time, actually. But those are different kinds of borders you can make. I'm going to go back to solid. And I'm going to change my color. Maybe I'll make it a little bit lighter. Let's make it 9. Like I said, you can change whatever color you want. So border has, again, 3 attributes: the size of the border, the style of the border, and the color of the border. So I just changed my color. I made it a little lighter gray. Kind of goes with the gray of my background. So, and again, because I have this navigation div across all 3 of my HTML pages, I can consistently have that navigation on the top. And then from here, it's just a matter of adding more pages if you want and linking them correctly, making sure everything is in your project folder. And it's all kind of there. It's just sort of the basic building blocks. With these, you know, once you learn how to do multiple column layouts, you might have a page where there are 3 columns, and you might have a page where there's only 2 columns. You can kind of mix and match on all your different pages. You just have to know which styles to apply. The other thing that I really like to do is just, you can use floats to make grids. Say you have a bunch of photos and you want to display them in a grid. I'm going to show you how to do that really quickly. Yes?
When you're doing margins,
Mm-hmm.
like in a 3-column layout, are you just working with the outside outside blocks?
Yeah.
It looks like. I mean, you're doing like margin right and left on those.
You can do it on the middle block too. It's a personal preference. Okay. Whatever makes most sense to you.
Look different on like a.
It won't look.
Or like mobile format?
It actually won't look that different. On a mobile format where they all stack together, you'll notice where the margins are. Like depending on like suddenly this column will look a little shorter.
Okay.
But for the purposes of desktop, mobile design is like way beyond the scope of this. If I applied the margins to the middle column, as opposed to the outer columns, it wouldn't look any different at all. So it's really up to you which one you find easier to work with.
Is that your preference?
That's my preference. Actually, my preference is to do the middle, because then I only have to put one set of margins. I'm a lazy bastard. Let's be real about this. So that's actually my preference, but I did it a different way here. So, any other questions? It's a great question. Cool. Yes.
Not working exactly with the same thing that you are. I put some images in so I could practice floating.
And that's what I'm going to do next, actually.
So how do I? But my images are butted up right against my navigation.
We'll fix that. I might have to fix that afterward.
Okay.
Yes, your question.
Can you explain clearly when do we have to use it?
Okay, so clear again. Like I said, clear almost always. I always make a class called clear in all my CSS files, and I add this rule: clear both. You use it after any floated items. So, for instance, in my about page, I have 3 columns, right? I have this left sidebar. Oh. I'll look at it. We'll look at it visually first, and then we'll look at it in code. I have these 3 columns. I have a left sidebar, a main div, and a right sidebar. But say I want to put something after this lovely 3-column design. If I just start typing without the clear, that's what's going to happen. I'm going to wind up with this trapped piece of content. I want it down here. I don't want to be trapped inside the box. So the clear comes into play. I have this, so this is my last floated column, that right sidebar. This is where I would put the clear if I didn't want to trap anything. What the clear says is so I'm using the clear to basically say, I want a fresh new line to start here. I want to make sure that whatever content I put after my last floated item, my last column, I want to ensure that nothing gets trapped under it. So I add the clear here because I want a new line. So instead of being trapped, if I refresh, I'm not trapped anymore. So I put the clear where I want to start a new line of content after floated items only. Does that make sense? Does it make better sense? Look what happens when I accidentally clear in the wrong place. It's actually pretty good. So say I take out this clear. And I have these sidebars, and I accidentally got a little too happy, and I put the clear in the wrong place. I put it right before this sidebar. If I refresh, whoops, I just broke my layout. And it's because I said, oh, I'm just going to clear out the space. Nothing's supposed to be here. I'm going to put that div on its own line. That's essentially what I said when I put the clear. And it was like, no, wait, sorry. I dropped somebody off the train by accident. So whenever you put a clear somewhere, it'll drop something onto it the next line. So in order to fix that problem, I got to remove that. And now they sit all next to each other. So clear clears out this empty space. It says make sure that nothing hangs out in the empty space that happens after a float. And make sure you put it on the next line. Like I said, working with multiple column layouts and floats, those are the kind of common problems that happen. If you see your layout, if you see trapped space, it means you didn't clear something. If one of your columns is awry, either you applied a clear or your math is incorrect. And they will never sit next to each other. Your math is just, it's too big. Those are the 2 most common problems when people start doing multiple column layouts. So always check your math. I keep a calculator with me for that purpose. Yes?
For the navigation,
Uh-huh.
I changed the color for the
The
little
pipes?
bars in between to receive blue.
Okay. I'll have to check your. Oh, yeah. I'll have to. I think I might know why, but I'll check yours afterward. Yeah, just come back to me after. The other thing I wanted to quickly demonstrate was floats making a really quick grid. I think this might be what Sarah's doing back there. So I'm going to give you 2 tips. Grab any images you want. I don't happen to have, or I might. If you downloaded the project.zip, there's probably some images in there already if you want to use them. Or you can just grab your own. But I like to do this. Create a div with a class called photo. And I'm going to throw an image in there. I'm going to use our lovely friends at Phil Murray. So http philmurray.com. And I'm going to grab an image that's 250 by 250 pixels. So 250 by 250. I have no idea what Bill Murray I'm going to come up with, but that's the joy of this. We'll see. I have a contemplative Bill Murray. And I'm just going to copy this 4 times. Actually, I'm going to do it 5 times as a demonstration. So again, I have a div with a class called photo, which I'm going to style in just a little bit. I'm going to make a grid here. And inside this div, I've placed an image of some variety. It said you can roll your own. It's all good. So right now, if I refresh my page, I have a little film strip of Bill Murray. That's not what I want. I need a grid of Bill Murrays. So remember, in our divs are block elements. They will always occupy 100% the width of my page. That's why I've got Bill Murray stacked on top of each other 5 times. Just like you would with multiple column layout, you would solve the problem the same way. I'm going to go into my style sheet. I'm going to make a class. I'm going to style this photo class. So dot for class, photo. First of all, I'm going to say, hey, I want these divs to be specific width. Let's say 200 pixels. I'm going to show you how to fix a very common problem. I purposely made this 200 pixels, even though I know the images inside are 250. I'm going to say, I want some margin. I don't want kissing cousin syndrome. And I'm going to float all of these so they sit next to each other. So the key here to make them sit next to each other is the float and the width. Assign a width. If I refresh, got some Bill Murrays sitting next to each other, but notice, even though I put a margin, there's no space in between them, right? That's because this image is 250 pixels wide, but the box that I put it inside is only 200 pixels. All of a sudden, my image is like, I don't care how big this box is. I'm gonna be as big as I want, as I am. Really easy way to fix this if you start to get into responsive design. 1 line, well actually technically 3 lines of CSS. This is another rule you will find in every single sheet I write. So I kind of like to group all the main things together. So here are all my tags. The image tag. Every single image that I put into my HTML will have this rule. I'm going to type it and then I'll explain it. Max width, 100%. Height, auto. These 4 lines of CSS. Look what happens when I go back to my gridables. Shazam. Even though the image I called up is 250 pixels wide, as indicated by this, and my box, my photo box, is 200 pixels wide, I basically wrestled Bill Murray into submission inside my box, thanks to that line of CSS I wrote. Image. So what this means? Max width 100%. This means that every image will never be wider than the box that it's contained in. Does that make sense? So the box that it's contained in right now is a div called photo. And that photo box is called 200 pixels wide. If I go back to my HTML. So here's my box with a class of photo. And inside it is an image. So what I've said is any image, do not make it any wider than the box that it's in. You'll sometimes see this happen if you don't have this rule. Like images just kind of spill out all over the place and you're like, why is my layout all jacked up? It's because your image is not obeying the rules. It's as wide as it has to be. But this cuts it down. It says, if I put you in a column that is yay wide, you as an image will not ever be wider than that column. You will submit to my width, damn it. Height auto basically resizes the height proportionally so your image doesn't look all distorted. This is a very nice, handy rule. It prevents a lot of pain in layouts. If you get into responsive design, this is how images can resize properly on phones. When you like turn your phone around and the image resizes, it's exactly how it's happening. So I'm able to take an image that was 250 pixels wide, and I'm able to put it inside a box that is 200 pixels wide, and it will look and display correctly. So I have a grid of bills here. If you notice I had 5, and the 5th one just kind of jumped to its own line. So when you float items left, they'll just keep they'll sit next to each other until they hit the end of the box, and then they're like, all right, so the next one's going to jump down automatically. Yes?
Is there a reason why my pictures are vertical aligned? They align vertically like that.
You probably didn't you probably are missing the float and the width. You're probably missing one of these two things. Okay, I'll check you in a second. Are you sure that your HTML is this, that you've closed the div around each image? Okay. Yeah, check that all your divs are closed. Using this, I can actually do a few other things here. So even if because I have this image rule, this 100% sort of like limiter, if at some point I decide that I'm going to change the width of my photo box to 175, no worries, I don't need to resize Bill Murray. He'll resize all by himself. It's all good. It's a great, great tool to use. But I can do a couple other things. I'm just going to change it back. Now I got 3 bills. Oh man. I can do a couple other things in displaying these photos. If I have this little grid going. Using the concept of nested selectors, say I wanted to manipulate all the images themselves inside the photo div. So here, remember this rule says I'm looking for any image tag inside an element that has the class of photo. So it's looking for something inside the photo class. I can do something like this. Maybe I'll add a 5-pixel solid border of, I don't know, ooh, just for display's sake, line. This is how you can achieve the Polaroid effect, actually. If the background was a different background color, I don't know if this is gonna work. No, it's not gonna work. Crap. Hold on, guys. I'm gonna do something real quick. Just gonna, just as a demonstration. I'm going to take this out of the final file, but just as a demonstration. Okay. So I have that white border around each image. If you want to make them look like Polaroids, it's really easy. So instead of border, so it would be border top. Border left. Border right. Border bottom is going to be much larger. So let's say 25. There you go. Really, really simple Polaroid style. If you wanted to take the Polaroid even further, this is where this gets fun. I'm going to keep this border just white for now. Let's say I had down here something like this. Oh. I'm going to add a class for caption. So I'm going to remove the border for now. I'm going to center align these. Okay. Oh. Here we go. That's what I want to do. I think that's what I actually want to do. Ah! So there's a lot of manipulation that needs to happen here. Sorry. I'm just going to go back to my original Control Z, Control Z. It would actually take a little more doing, but if you wanted just the basic, like, let me remove this. The basic look. You know, Polaroids always have the extra leading edge at the bottom. I just did that with a simple border via CSS. Could make this even larger if I wanted a bigger tag. So the border bottom is just larger than the rest. Yes?
Is there a way to center those photos so that it's not all shifted to like the left?
Oh yeah. You'd probably, because each of these are a separate div, you'd probably have to do the math to see how wide. Yeah. There's not a super simple way around it, unfortunately. Yes.
Could you throw them all into a bigger container though and then center them in the container?
You could. So I could do something like, okay, I'm going to remove this. Sorry. Actually, I'm going to keep that there so that you can see the background. And do something like this. Just what Sarah said. Throw a div around all the photos. So basically this grid is as wide as all these photos are. And I can say something like grid margin 0 auto. So remember that the first number is top and bottom, the second value is left and right, and so it will automatically calculate what margin has to be Oh, that didn't work. Pafut. Or you could do the math. Huh, that didn't work. I'll have to figure out why. I thought it would work. I thought it was being smart. Or you'd have to figure out the math, which is just such a giant pain. I'll have to figure out why that doesn't work. It should, but that's a really good question. Yeah, that's how you can do like a really simple kind of like photo style. If you have a grid of photos, you want to show like your Instagram photos or something like that and make them create a nice little frame for them. Just play around with the borders of your images. You know, if you wanted to actually put like a caption down here, it's a little more work, but you could do that too, just with finagling various styles. You could even like turn them in different directions, but that's a little more advanced. That's what we call CSS animation, and I've done it where you can turn this like this way and this photo is that way, so you can make a nice little collage image. I'll show you an example. I like to call this the drunken example. See if I can find it. I mean, obviously, this is beyond the scope of this class, but notice how all the letters are just askew. This is all just CSS. I roll over one, I can do these kinds of effects. My E can spin around on a hover. L's kicking the L, as I like to say. And the O just kind of spins. This is all just CSS. If you want to look it up, CSS animations, they're super, super fun. This is one of my favorite things to do. But it's a way that you can achieve like a collage effect without having to do this in Photoshop. So, yes?
How did you get the background to be black again?
Oh, I just threw a div around the whole thing. And I was really lazy, so I used inline styles to style it. I just put a background. This is the last thing I want to talk about, and then I'll talk about servers and fun stuff like that. Overflow hidden. This is one of those things where it works, and a friend of mine who's smarter than I am tried to explain to me how this works. I was just like, huh? Like I literally had this glazed over look, and like I couldn't quite understand. But overflow hidden is a CSS property, and you'll notice on my container, my original container, I have that rule here. This is a way to prevent floated items from kind of going south. Notice what happens. Actually, I'm not going to put it here. I'm going to remove it. I'm going to remove it from here, from this background, real quick. Notice what happened when I removed that overflow hidden from my inline style, because I was being lazy. So this is what it looked like before. Overflow hidden was on that div. And this had a black background around it. But notice what happens when I remove that style. Oh, what happened to my background? So sad. That's because these are all floated items. All my bills are floats, right? Correct? I mean, I added a class of photo, and that class had an attribute of float right. Basically, the short, it's still technical explanation, but the explanation I was given is that when you float items, you basically render their height useless. The browser doesn't know how tall these items are. It just sees them as one flat thing. So that's why this div that surrounds all of my Bill Murrays, like that's why it's not showing. It doesn't realize that it has to be this tall to contain all the Bill Murrays, because these are all floated items. Overflow hidden kind of fixes that problem. And like I said, I can't really explain why. It's just one of those things that works. Trust me, I've tried to find a good way to explain it, and I haven't found one yet. But overflow hidden kind of fixes the problem where backgrounds disappear when you have floated items inside a div. It kind of forces that background to not to not be hidden. So anytime you have like a main container and you're gonna have floated items inside it, I suggest you just add that rule, overflow hidden. Or the other thing that I could do if I didn't have overflow hidden is after the last item in this set, so this is the last photo, the last floated item, just throw a clear at the end. That will fix the problem as well, actually. Either of those techniques works. I just think overflow hidden is easier because it's in the CSS. You don't have to remember to float. Ah, it's gone. But clear also works as well. So I just added the clear at the end after the last item. And I refresh. It gives me my background back. So, like I said, I just did it inline style because I was lazy, to be real. Whoops. Any other questions? Sorry I can't center these correctly. I gotta figure out why that doesn't work. Or you can do the math. It's a very nice photo. Don't worry. In the last remaining time I have, I just want to mention servers. So you can go ahead and start building some pages, some really basic pages, as you can see. You can do really basic layouts, 2-column layouts, 3-column layouts. Go nuts. Really basic navigation, basic styles and text. Use Google Fonts. Super fun. If you want to put your stuff up for the entire world to see, because of course I'm sure you do. You have several options. If you're a USC student, you do have web space here at USC. Do know that it disappears when you graduate. That's what happened to me. So if you want to play around and you don't have a ton of cash, you don't want to foot money for a personal server, just use your USC servers. You need to have what's called an FTP program. Does anybody know what FTP is? Yep, file transfer protocol. It's how you get files from your desktop onto a server. I use a really fancy one called Transmit. It's not free. If you're not fancy like me, you can use CyberDuck. It's actually what I used to use before I used Transit. Believe CyberDuck is available for PCs and Macs. Used to be a Mac-only deal. If you're a USC student, you can download Fetch for free. Normally, Fetch is a paid program. Most of my students love Fetch because whenever you transfer a file, the icon is a running dog. It's cute. If you are on a PC, Fetch is Mac only, by the way. Sorry, PC users. If you're on a PC, you can also use FileZilla. It's free. FileZilla is available for Windows and Mac. In general, if you need your USC credentials to get on the server, you can contact IT. I believe if you go to the IT page for USC, it'll give you directions. But generally how these things work, if you've never used FTP before, is you have to connect to a server. And in general, you use FTP, File Transfer Protocol. You got to put in the server name, your username, and a password. And again, you can get these via the USC IT folks if you want to go into your own USC server. You would get a server, username, and password. You would connect by clicking on the connection, and then you would get into your particular server. If you are going to transfer your files, make sure you transfer everything to the server. Keep the same structure. Don't screw around with this. when you open a server, you're usually inside what's called a root directory, just like you have a folder, and this is the root of your folder. You have the root of a directory. That's where you just move your files. I can't move stuff right now because I have things in my particular server. Actually, wait, I probably could. So I'm just going to move all these files into my particular server. Everything's going to transfer. So remember, whenever you go to a URL, the first thing the server looks for is an index.html file. So make sure that index.html file is in the root. If I go to this particular domain, hey, look, it's that project I just created. And if I go to the About Me, because the About Me page is on my server, I can navigate just fine, actually. I don't have any broken links. I have nothing broken. And that's why it's really important to keep all your work in a single folder. That way things don't go astray. If you don't want to use your USC server, or you are about to graduate and you don't want it to disappear, a couple of hosts that I use, Bluehost.com. I think a lot of stuff here at USC, they promote Bluehost. I've used them for years. I've used them on my clients for years. Pretty fantastic. Cheap. If you want to get wicked fancy, Media Temple. It's more expensive, but I use Media Temple for my larger clients. You know, we're talking people who have like hundreds of thousands of people visiting their websites every day. It's a little more high. It's a little higher capacity. Media Temple is. But if you're just gonna build a personal site, or you're eventually gonna put on a WordPress blog, Bluehost will do you well. Pretty basic hosting. Their customer service is pretty decent. And like I said, I put a lot of my clients on Bluehost actually, and they haven't had very many problems. There's also a place called Fat Cow. A lot of these hosting joints are pretty similar. They're even similar in pricing, so to me they're kind of dime a dozen. So Bluehost, Fat Cow. You can also, with all these domains, with all these hosting companies, you can also buy your domains through them. So you can keep your domain and your hosting in the same place. If you bought a domain elsewhere, like you went to GoDaddy one night and you decided to buy like 100 domains, true story, one of my clients owns 800 domains on GoDaddy. You can host through GoDaddy, but you can have your domains in one place and host on another. That's not an unusual arrangement at all. Your hosting company, if you sign up for hosting, that's one of the first things they'll ask you is your domain, do you want to buy a new domain? Or do you want to transfer an existing domain? Or do you have a domain that exists somewhere else? So they can help you out if you want to keep your domain separate from your hosting. My personal place where I go to buy domains, it's a place called namecheap.com. As the name implies, it's pretty cheap. Yearly. I actually have several domains hanging out on Namecheap. I haven't attached them to sites yet. So if you don't want the commitment of buying hosting just yet, you can pick up a couple of domains. Your name is usually a good one. And then when you graduate, you'll have some domains you've hung on to, and you can attach them to hosting then if you want. So, I always suggest you pick up your name. I have both. I used to own my maiden name. I don't anymore. They're pretty cheap yearly, so don't go nuts. Don't buy 800. Don't be like one of my clients. Literally 800 domains. He owns 800 domains. It's kind of insane. But yeah. If any of y'all got questions, just come up to me after. But that's yes.
What about something like AWS or Rackspace? Is that for more advanced hosting?
Like how much it is, or that's what you want to
No,
use?
it's like more advanced type of web hosting.
Yeah, it's a different kind of hosting. I mean, those are usually for folks who want to configure their own server. Like these are generally for people who like have no idea how to configure a server. It's just like here's shared server space, so you're sharing it with like 10,000 neighbors essentially on one box. But if you have like I do have some higher end clients who want to have their own dedicated server. That's when you would go to like a Rackspace or AWS or something like that. It's usually, I mean, it's expensive as hell, first of all. But you know, some clients like that's what they need because they have so much traffic, or they for security reasons they need a dedicated server. But for most people who just need personal, like I just want to put up a website about me and my portfolio, like shared hosting is the way to go. I mean, it's going to cost you $80 a year as opposed to upwards of like $800 a year. So, but if you want to eventually create websites for other people, you can buy your own dedicated box and partition it off to like 800 people and be like, okay, you guys can pay me for hosting every month. So it's a way to make money. I personally don't do that because I don't like configuring servers. I'd rather not. So, great question. Any other questions? Yes.
Or if you want to use WordPress and you want to customize CSS and all that for it, is there like a different process you do for that, or?
Yes. There's WordPress.com, which is the hosted WordPress. WordPress.org is what you're looking for. That's the version that you can install on your own server. And most major hosts, Bluehost, Media Temple, GoDaddy, etc., if you buy hosting through them, they have what's called one-click install, so they will install WordPress for you. Yeah. And that version, you can do whatever you want. You can put whatever plugins you want. You can make custom themes. You can use whatever themes you want. You can change the CSS for certain things. Absolutely. You can do whatever you want with it. It's more flexible than the .com. So, but it does require your own hosting. So, another really great question. Any other questions? Nobody else has any questions. That's all I've got for today. Thank you all for coming.